So our first presentation today, we will have two speakers, Steve Johnson and Eleni Petrou. Eleni studies the ecology and evolution of marine organisms using genetics. She also investigates how humans have used marine resources over long periods of time using ancient DNA. Eleni is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Washington, where she is working on a project with the Sitka tribe of Alaska to investigate the population structure of Pacific herring. Steve Johnson is a well-known storyteller from Sitka, Alaska. When not working on cultural projects, he is commercial fishing. Johnson also hunts and traps for food and furs. He is recognized as a cultural expert in food gathering and is featured on numerous TV programs, books, and storytelling events. And I will now hand it over to Steve and Eleni.
And everybody, welcome to WellFest. We're coming to you from the Science Center in beautiful downtown Sitka. And in the Tlingit tradition, I'm going to introduce myself to you in our language. And we do this so that you know who we are and where our words come from and where our families come from, but also to build connections. And so that when we talk about being together and when we talk about working together, we're talking about being part of a larger family. Iktik ish yuchat duasal Tlingit fenachsa kiksadi aya ach ish has kagwantan. My Tlingit name is Iktik ish. I am from the Kiksadi people of Sitka, and my father's people are the Kagwantan. My father was probably one of the most influential people in my life, and my grandfather and my uncle. And when we were all together as a family, I was still very young. And one of my earliest memories was of catching herring in Sitka Sound. It seemed like everything in the world would stop when the herring would get close. People would call in sick to work, boats that were tarped, the tarps would come off. People were working on their motors, and everyone in the community was getting ready for the herring that were coming. Every morning, people would get up, smell the air. When the herring get near, you can start to smell them in the air and you can start to feel their presence in our backyard. And one of my earliest memories, wearing little yellow boots and that funky little blue life jacket, was being in a small little skiff, a little Boston whaler, with my dad and my uncle, and seeing the herring spawn on the surface of the water, and seeing the herring in it, seeing them turn, seeing them move, seeing them flip together. And my dad and my uncle were tying together ropes and tying together branches and looking for places to set the branches so that in the next few days, we would have crunchy, delicious eggs to eat. I'm sure it was probably just the inconvenience to them, but they took a 1-gallon milk jug and cut off the top and let me play in the water with the herring. I would scoop it down in the water and I would get 1 or 2 of them and I would throw them in the skiff. And I would pick them up and look at them and see the way they moved, feel the way their scales stuck to me. And in the very beginning of my memories, that is where my connection and affinity for herring began, is playing with them as a little kid. And then after we got our branches set, we went to shore and built a little fire. I was probably soaked, as I think I usually was most days as a kid. We dried out, took some of those herring, put them on a little stick and roasted them over the fire. And if you've ever had a fresh herring roasted over the fire, you know that when you put that on a cracker, it melts almost like butter. And that taste and that flavor is amazing and something that you will never forget. My grandfather was a very well-known cultural bearer and storyteller. And I'm grateful that he left a lot of that information to me. And one of the stories that he told was about the creation, about the beginning of time, about the beginning of Tlingit time. Because we who are Tlingit are the people of the tide. And long ago, the world was all water. Everything was coated in water. There was no land, there was no mountains, there was no trees. There was just one being, a raven. We call him Nashigiyesh. And Nashigiyesh was flying around the world, and he was looking at the water, and he began to wonder what was in it. And so one day he flew really high up into the sky and then straight down. When he hit the water, it lifted up like a blanket and it surrounded him. He folded his wings in close and he swam towards the bottom. As he looked up, he could see the daylight starting to fade, the world beneath him, dark, gray. He could see shadows, and he could feel other creatures in the water as they swam by him, but he could not see them. As he got further and further and further into the water, he could hear a sound in the distance. Dum, 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 like a giant heartbeat. Dum, dum. He began to swim towards that sound, towards the bottom, and he could see off in the distance little flashes of light. The iridescence like a rainbow, like a prism, shining in the distance. The raven swam closer, and as he got closer, he could feel the beat of the drum in the water. Boom, boom, boom. He got to a place at the edge of a house on the bottom of the ocean, and there was a little crack in the boards that he could look through. He stuck his beak through there, and he positioned one eye through there. And in there, he could see the herring dancing together, twisting, spinning, touching each other, dancing around in a circle on the bottom in this house. And all around them were these little bubbles, were these little eggs. And there was a blanket, a light colored blanket floating in the water that these eggs danced in as the herring moved. One of the eggs drifted over and got stuck to his eye. One of them got stuck to his beak, and they began to get stuck to his feathers. He looked at them, and he decided to taste it. It was salty, crunchy, and it was good. As the eggs began to drift in the water and stick to him, he started eating, and he could not stop. The raven had eaten so much that he passed out, laying down on the bottom of the ocean. He could look up to the sky, and he could just barely see the daylight above him, but everything was in darkness. And he knew that he might be stuck down here, too heavy and too full to make it back to the surface. The raven lay down on the bottom, and he listened to the drum all night long. Boom, boom, boom. When he woke up, he could see the daylight much closer, and he could feel the water against his feet. And he looked around, and he realized that the water was gone, and that the house was gone, and that the herring were gone. And he was laying on the beach on his back, still full, and still thinking about what he had saw. The eagles flew overhead. Other ravens flew around. He could picture the herring dancing. He could hear their song. And he could feel their presence was not far away. When I was a teenager, herring fishing was a profitable thing, and everybody wanted to get a job on a herring boat. And there were herring fisheries everywhere: Casheets, Seymour Canal, Kodiak. One of the boats I was on, we made set after set after set. And every single one, we would plug the boat, we would plug the tenders, and we would have to head into town. And I remember lying on my back on top of a pile of web and thinking about all the things I was going to blow my money on. 3-second anti-skip CD player, lift kit for the truck. All of these things that seemed extremely important to me and my teenage mind. Maybe I'll buy a new truck. Yeah. One more year of fishing like this, I could get a new truck. Little did I know that that would be the last time that I would fish for herring. Next year, they didn't come back. And we were ready for them, but it never happened. And I remember my grandfather and many of the elders in town would talk about a time before World War II in the 1930s, back when they were young kids, how many herring used to be in Sitka Sound, in Crawfish Bay, around Bjorka, everywhere, Salisbury, and all different runs, some of them early, some of them all the way late, some of them almost all the way to June. There were herring everywhere. And now we have 25, 50, 60 miles of spawn in Sitka Sound. And I began to think about these things as I'm laying on the back deck of a fishing boat. And I think about the raven who ate too much. The raven, if it were not for the ocean parting ways and bringing him to the surface, would have drowned from his greed. And I think about all the creatures that rely on the herring for our food: the halibut, the salmon, the seals. Everything in the ocean survives on herring. And here I was, killing them for dollars, for things that did not have as much meaning. But at the time in my teenage brain, the only thing I could think of was what I didn't have. As I have gotten older and start to reach middle age, I've watched these things. I've watched Hoona Sound, the pound fishery, go. I've watched Seymour Canal, Hawk Bay, Kodiak, all these places that used to make tens of thousands of dollars for crew members, for families, for myself. Nobody fishes there anymore. The fish never came back. The place as a little kid where I picked herring out of the water and where we barbecued them on the beach, they no longer spawn there. And it's not that far away from town. These are things in my life that I have seen. And then I look at other places in the world: San Francisco, Puget Sound, Lummi, Salish. These are places where people like me, tribal people, used to gather herring eggs and share them with their families and their community. And Sitka is the last place. It is the last place that happens. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but these are things in my lifetime that I have seen and that I have witnessed. And the one question that I have is, will I have to explain these things to my children when I start a family? Am I going to have to tell them about how herring used to be, how we used to do these things? At what point do we trade our future, our food security for dollars? When is enough enough? And I really hope that people think about this and think about how important it is to our community, even just in the terms of basic food, basic protein outside our back door that we can all get and enjoy. These things are super important to us, not only to our culture, but to our future. And so I thank you guys for inviting me to speak. I hope that we can work together and that we don't have to tell stories of how the herring used to be, but how they are and how they will be. Thank you, honorable people.
Oh, I can't share my screen. Unmute. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Eleni Petru, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar from the University of Washington. I'm very honored to be here with you today at WhaleFest, and I'll be speaking about some research on Pacific herring genetics. Before I start, I want to take a moment to thank all of my mentors, collaborators, and funding sources for this large project. It was a big endeavor, and it wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of many different people and organizations. In particular, I'd like to thank my local collaborators, the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and my PhD advisor, Lawrence Hauser. So let's talk a little bit more about this ecosystem role of herring. Herring feed on phytoplankton and zooplankton, and in doing so, they transfer energy from the base of the food chain higher up, because in turn, they are fed upon by large predators such as salmon and whales. And so they're a critical link in this transfer of energy in the marine food web. Now, as adults every year, herring come into the nearshore environment in winter and early spring in preparation for spawning. And this is a glorious ecological event. It's very beautiful, as you can tell from this video. And when this happens, herring are also followed by many predators. Some examples of herring predators are things like that you know intimately in Sitka, like salmon and seabirds and whales. But you'll also notice on this slide that there's some terrestrial predators as well. And maybe some of you have been lucky enough to see them in person. So maybe you've seen bears and wolves come down after a herring spawn to feast on herring eggs. Humans also value herring as a food resource. So you heard Steve talk about the importance of gathering herring eggs. And here there's a picture showing him and his crew getting eggs on hemlock. There's also a picture of people gathering herring roe on kelp from Haida Gwaii. And this is a traditional and beloved food resource and a great source of nutrition as well. And another way that herring are important to human communities is in the form of commercial fisheries that provide income for coastal livelihoods. Now, herring have been fished for more than 10,000 years, and we know this from the archaeological record. So for example, in Southeast Alaska, when you compare the percent herring to all other fish bones in a particular archaeological site, on average, 20% of all fish bones belong to herring. If you go further south, let's say to the Salish Sea around Seattle, on average, 75% of all fish bones found at archaeological sites are herring. So this tells us that herring were consistently used throughout time and were a very important food resource for people. Now, the industrial exploitation and overexploitation of herring started in the late 19th century with the colonization of the Pacific Northwest by Europeans. And to give you a sense of the scale of this resource extraction, I'm showing you a plot of herring catch from the years 1910 to 2010 from Prince William Sound in Alaska. So on the x-axis is the year of fishing, and on the y-axis is the catch in thousands of metric tons. And you can see that in some years in the 30s and 40s, people were taking out tens of thousands of metric tons of herring from a single place. And as early as the 1930s, fishery scientists were warning that stocks in Southeast Alaska were being overfished and crashing, and they needed to be protected and allowed to recover. This kind of information is also shared by Alaska Native elders who hold traditional ecological knowledge. So to illustrate this, I want to read a quote to you from Harvey Kitka, who is Kagwantan in Sitka. He says, "So many places had their own big bodies of herring. Crawfish Bay was one of those places. One year they seined down in that area for the commercial sacro fishery, and there hasn't been anything that way in a long time." In addition to hearing about contractions in the spatial extent of herring spawning activity, we also hear about contractions in the total amount of time that herring spawning activity occurs in a particular place. So in other words, people have noticed in some areas that herring start to spawn later in the year and finish spawning earlier in the year. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about this biological diversity in herring spawn timing, because not all herring populations spawn at the same time. To illustrate this, I'm showing you herring spawning locations in the Salish Sea in Washington State. So each of these colorful squiggly lines on the map is a spawning site. There's over 20 of them in our stretch of the Salish Sea. And the different color of the site shows you the time of year that spawning occurs. So cool colors means that spawning happens earlier in the winter. Kind of pink colors means that spawning happens in March and April, early spring. And that bright yellow color means that herring are spawning there in May. And based on what we've talked about with the ecosystem role of herring, you might start to wonder whether this protracted spawn period has implications for predators that depend on herring. So for example, maybe the fact that you have a diverse portfolio of herring populations spawning over a long period of time means that herring are available to predators over a long period of time. And for example, this young juvenile Chinook salmon is an example of a herring predator that depends on larval herring to grow and to survive. So as a PhD student, I started to wonder whether herring that spawn at different places and at different times are from genetically distinct populations. To answer this question, I worked with collaborators to sample over 1,000 herring from 23 distinct spawning sites along the Northwest coast. So those are depicted by the colorful points. And we tried to target spawning areas in different places and spawning sites that had diverse spawn timing, so ranging from January to June. And we'd go out on a boat during an active spawning event. So here we are on the central coast of BC. And I want to show you a video of what spawning looks like. So here we have Females laying their sticky eggs on seagrasses, and then the males swimming by and fertilizing those eggs by spraying sperm in the water. So the water turns this really dramatic turquoise color. And a lot of you have seen this happen in Sitka. So while that was happening, we were catching fish and taking a small fin clip from each fish and putting that in alcohol to preserve the DNA. Once I had those samples, I took them back to the lab at the University of Washington, where I extracted the DNA. So I separated it from the other lipids, proteins, and carbs that make up animal cells. And I prepared it for DNA sequencing. What that means is that, so when you get DNA sequences back, you're able to actually read the genetic code of life. So you can read the A, T, Gs, and Cs, those nucleotides that make up the code of life. And then I looked at those DNA sequences and I looked for sites in the genome that contained variation. So for example, here we have two different herring. One of them at a particular site has a cytosine nucleotide, while another one has a thymine nucleotide. And I was interested in those variable sites because they write the history, the evolutionary history of populations. So they contain information about the amount of natural selection that a population has experienced, how isolated it is, or how connected it is to neighboring populations. And I want to show you what some of that data looks like. So I will show you a plot that summarizes the results from this study in 2 dimensions that we can easily see and interpret. So in this plot, each dot is an individual herring that has information for 7,000 of those variable DNA markers. The color of the dot tells you the time of year that that herring spawned. And the way you interpret this plot is the closer 2 dots together are to each other in the graph, the more closely related they are to each other. So what we see here, and the pattern that pops out at us, is that individuals are clustering by their spawn timing. So down on the lower left-hand side of the plot in orange, we see those late spring spawners that reproduce in May. The winter spawners are above them in dark blue, and the spring spawners reproducing in March and April are at the top of the plot in pink. So that's the pattern that we observed in Washington State. Now I'll add on samples that we collected from British Columbia. So those are shown by the open triangles. And what you see here is those March-April spawners from British Columbia are clustering close together with the March-April spawners from Washington State. And the late spawners from BC, you can see those in orange and yellow, and those are forming their own distinct cluster. So that means that those populations are relatively reproductively isolated and on their own evolutionary lineage. Now I'll add on the populations from Southeast Alaska. So here we sampled 2 sites, or 1 site in Sitka, 1 in Salisbury Sound, and 1 in Lynn Canal at Berners Bay. And the pattern that emerges when we have our full data set is, first of all, that populations with different spawn timing are genetically distinct from each other. And secondly, this pattern of geographic differentiation starts to pop out at us, where we see that the more distant 2 populations are spatially from each other, the more distantly related they are. So they're populations that are close together in time and in space are more closely related to each other. And we start to see this picture emerging that this spawn timing diversity likely has a genetic basis. Now I want to cycle back to this idea of this biodiversity in herring being important to human communities. And I want to tell you a story about that that's centered on Coast Salish ancestors from the Puget Sound. So just to orient you again, the Puget Sound is this large estuary close to Seattle in Washington State, and it contains a diversity of herring populations. So as I said before, populations that spawn in January all the way to May. And the Puget Sound, since time immemorial, is also the homeland of the Coast Salish people. And there's numerous archaeological sites in the Sound that document people's use of natural resources and kind of their villages and where they used to live and fish. So we received permission to analyze herring bones from 2 archaeological sites in the Puget Sound, the Burton Acre Shell Midden and the Bay Street Shell Midden. They're both coastal sites where people used coastal resources. The Burton Acre Shell Midden is in the traditional territory of the Puyallup tribe, while the Bay Street Shell Midden is in the traditional territory of the Suquamish tribe. And here I want to illustrate to you what those herring bones look like. So they're tiny, tiny bones, millimeters in size, and they were preserved in shell middens at these archaeological sites. Shell middens kind of look like layer cakes when you excavate them. So there's older layers that are older, deeper layers that are older, and then shallower layers that are younger. So we collected about 100 bones from each site from an old layer that was dated to between 900 and 500 years old, and a young layer that was a couple hundred years old. And I'm just showing you in these plots in the middle of the slide, the relative proportion of herring bones compared to all other fish bones at both of these sites. And for example, at Burton Acres, you can see that in some layers, herring made up more than 90% of the catch. So herring were consistently abundant and important to the diets of Coast Salish ancestors. These bones were identified. So we had a zooarchaeologist, that's a special archaeologist that studies animal bones, pick apart the herring bones from the other fish bones. And then he sent those bones to me, and I took them to a special ancient DNA lab in Canada, where we carefully extracted the ancient DNA from those archaeological herring bones. And we did that while zipped up into these uncomfortable and funky looking suits, because you have to be very careful when you're working with archaeological samples to not contaminate them with your own DNA. So it's a tricky process. Then we analyzed each of those samples at a subset of our variable DNA markers. And using that genetic information, we were able to actually estimate the ancestry of our sample. So we took our archaeological sample and tried to match it to a modern population to get a sense of the spawn timing diversity that was present in the archaeological and the ancient samples. So I'll walk you through some of those results right now. This plot is showing you the relative proportion of the different spawning groups in our archaeological samples. So for example, in blue, we have those winter spawning January, February fish. In green, we have March, April spawners. And in yellow, we have May spawners. On the bottom part of the graph, it's showing you the results from the Burton Acres site, while the top part of the graph is showing you the results from the Bay Street site. And so for example, if we look at the Burton Acres layer that is almost 900 years old, that's shown in the lower bottom part of the graph, we see that people were using the full diversity of herring populations that were available to them. So people were utilizing those winter, spring, and late spring spawners. Another thing we learned is that at the Bay Street Shell Midden, we really see a consistent use of both the winter and early spring spawners through time. So that tells us that that population diversity existed in the past, and it was important to the food security and livelihoods of people in the past. So I'd like to leave you with some parting thoughts. First of all, that forage fish like herring are very important to marine food webs, and I know those of you in Sitka have intimate knowledge of this fact. Secondly, that diverse herring populations support marine predators and human communities, both now and in the past. And finally, that even in a species as humble and seemingly abundant as the Pacific herring, we see that this biological diversity is precious and it's worth conserving. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and we'd be happy to take any of your questions.
All right. Thank you, Eleni and Steve. That was absolutely fabulous. Okay, so we're going to open it up for the Q&A. And so I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, to type them in the whova.com Q&A panel. And we'll just get to them right now. I'm going to read out a few. So here's a question for Eleni. There has been a lot of debate about culling harbor seals in the Salish Sea to increase salmon. If that went ahead, do you think it would affect the herring population? And has anyone looked at this?
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's that's far out of my wheelhouse. I'm not aware of anyone who's looked at this specifically. I know people are talking about it.
Mhm.
So I don't have any insights to share with you there. Steve, do you want to share anything? Maybe I'll turn off my background too.
The Canadians have kind of a different attitude towards wildlife and maritime management. And oftentimes they have these ideas and they just go for it. And so I'm familiar with that uh, proposal and the people that are behind it. But there's not really a lot of quantifiable data. It's just more conjecture to think that if we kill more predators, then there'll be more herring.
Sounds good. We have another question here that Steve might be able to answer. I know that Atlantic herring were salted for food, and I was wondering if Alaska natives did something similar.
Well, salt is a lot harder to concentrate in this environment. You have to, trap seawater and let it evaporate or cook it. A lot of their herring in traditional times were dried and smoked, which is actually a lot better for your heart and a lot better for your system if you don't use a lot of salt to do it. And smoked herring keep really well too.
Okay.
Tasty.
Yeah, nice. Okay, thank you for that. Let's see, one of our other popular questions. I know that the herring fishery in Sitka hasn't happened in the last couple of years. And do you think that it will rebound and come back?
It happened last year, and they co-opted, and they didn't take as much as their quota had allowed. There is new management on the fish and game side of things, and they seem to be more constructive in thinking about the overall management of it. But really, it's going to take a lot of community support and a lot of people to say, hey, look, something's happening here, and this is benefiting a few amount of people versus the larger community as a whole.
And the ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Let's see. Here's a question probably for Eleni. How do you isolate DNA? Do you use chemicals or filters?
Yeah, we actually use a little bit of both. So we use some chemicals and proteins. So the first step is to use this enzyme that kind of breaks down all the proteins. And then we use a silica filter and chemicals. So the DNA sticks to this silica filter, and then the different chemicals will wash away carbohydrates and lipids and then chopped up proteins. And at the very end, we add kind of salt solution to the silica filter, which makes it release the DNA. So then we can spin it down and store it. So that's how that happens.
Very cool. You can kind of picture that happening. That's a great explanation. Let's see. Okay. The next question we have, what do you think would happen if the herring completely disappeared?
Well, they are a key building block in the food chain of the ocean. And I mean, everything eats herring, king salmon, halibut, black cod. And, herring even eat herring. So, if they went away, that is a substantial food source that would have to be replaced somehow in the ecosystem, or else it will die.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, if fish can't eat, that's what it is. And they're pretty, resilient and can switch to different food sources. But herring has just been such a part of their diet for as long as time can tell.
Yeah. And if something stepped in and took its place, it might be a different type of food that would give them different, energy or proteins or fats. So it would affect the food chain either way.
My own observation is it's irreplaceable.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there is enough abundance of other food sources to really carry the kind of population that we have in the ocean now, if it were to disappear. I mean, nothing else really has a raw nutritional value in mass.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Next question. I'm just going by the ones that are getting the most amount of votes here on my screen. Do you think putting more restrictions on herring fishing is the best way to save the herring?
Yeah, maybe, or having a bit better science so that the stock assessments are more accurate and are taking into account that there are these genetically diverse populations that might not be connected to each other through migration and gene flow. So I don't know the extent to which people are worried about that and are worried about the fact that maybe fisheries by accident harvest at a higher rate than is sustainable, some of these smaller genetically isolated populations. So that's something that, from my perspective as a geneticist, I worry about a lot. Steve?
And I agree, you know, they have some similarities to salmon in that they return to their same areas to spawn year after year, generation after generation. And so if you clean out one beachfront or if you clean out one school that's heading to one area, then they don't come back. Unless they're seeded or, you know, unless there's some kind of intervention. You know, once you kill it, it's done. I mean, you look at Seymour Canal, Casheets Bay, and those places that used to have phenomenal herring runs. They're dead.
Yeah. Yeah, that is true.
And it's not that long ago. I mean, we're talking like 10 years, you know?
Yeah. Things are happening within life, within generations instead of across generations.
Right. You know, it's one thing to hear stories about it. It's another thing to witness it. And even most recently, you look at Puna Sound and the pound fishery there, which, you know, is a fairly sustainable fishery, but they kind of overcapped it and that's it. They never came back.
Yeah.
And that's happened within the past few years.
Okay. Let's see. The next question we have is, what do herring eggs taste like?
Delicious.
Well, as a connoisseur, there are different varieties, and there are some on kelp, and there are some that come out of the fish itself, and then there are some on branches. And each one has its own merits and its own preservation techniques, but the basic flavor of it is pretty mild and neutral and salty. And the longer you leave them in the water too, the saltier they get. If you harvest them when they're ripe, you know, freshly spawned, like within hours, they're slightly chewy until the outside shell hardens up a little bit. And so those are the best if you just want to eat them fresh and raw out of the ocean. You take that and a little piece of black seed, you roll it together.
Nice.
Breakfast champions.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about how the taste, the flavor changes depending on when you harvest, how long they've been, you know, on branches or in the water. That's a good.
And so one handful of herring roe equals the nutritional value of 5 premier protein shakes.
Wow.
It's truly a superfood.
Yep.
It's raw protein that's directly soluble to your system, unlike plant-based proteins, which take more time, more energy to break down. You know, you lose like 40% efficiency from whey protein compared to like herring protein. The aminos are much better for your system.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
you can feel it too. I mean, you eat one handful of it and you can feel, you know, your strength and things building.
Wow, that is wonderful. They are delicious. Anyone that, you know, any of the audience that's in Sitka or been around Sitka during the herring spawn, I'm sure knows. And we're all probably dreaming of that taste right now as we talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And this year, myself and a group of volunteers, we gathered up a bunch of eggs and gave them away. And if there's people that want to learn about it or want to do it, welcome aboard.
Wonderful. Oh, that's so wonderful. Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question. The next one with the most votes. Well, this will be hard to answer quickly, but what do you think the far future of herring populations will look like?
I mean, that's so hard to answer because these fish have been on our planet for tens of millions of years. So they are resilient. I wonder if with climate change, I know there's been some kind of population models that show, or ecological models that show that maybe there'll be a northward migration of herring. So maybe we'll see something like that, but hopefully they'll still find habitats to spawn on, and they'll be around for tens of millions of years more.
The one thing that we've seen is the decline of it. I mean, you look at places where they have fished these things pretty heavily, British Columbia, San Francisco Bay, Monterey Bay, these places that used to have substantial herring populations, no longer anymore. And you've seen the steady decline in population, you know, from right around the turn of the 1900s till now. And I would hope that that doesn't continue and that these things continue to grow and build. And within Sitka in the past few years, they have started to go that way. But, you know, my fear is it might be too little too late, you know.
Yeah.
At what point do we draw the line? And I make my living fishing. I'm not opposed to killing fish for money, but I sure don't want to kill it off for good. I'd like to be able to say, hey, look, you know, we took good care of this and now you can do the same.
Yeah. Finding the balance there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Well, we, as much as I would just love to keep talking, we're going to need to take a quick break.